Hi, my name is Tim Tangherlini. I'm delighted and honored to be one of the first speakers in this Belief Narrative Network lecture series. I've been a long-time member of the BNN, and I look forward to hearing your questions about my relatively brief presentation. I apologize, we've had a lot of wildfires here in California, and up until this morning, the air was filled with smoke, and it has obviously taken a toll on my voice. I hope it's not too distracting that I am a little bit hoarse, and I do hope that you enjoy my presentation, which is entitled Conspiracy in the Time of COVID. Along with colleagues, particularly Vwani Roy Chowdhury in the Electrical Engineering and Computer Science Department at UCLA, I've been developing computational methods for understanding how conspiracy theories and conspiracies can be distinguished from each other, and developing generative models for various genres of believable narratives that are told as true. I want to start off today's presentation by introducing two scandals, Bridgegate and Pizzagate. In 2016, Chris Christie was implicated in a political payback operation, causing 5 days of traffic chaos in New Jersey in the district of one of his critics. This became known as Bridgegate, and this was the events happened in September of 2013. As the conspirators went to trial, WikiLeaks began leaking hacked emails from the Democratic National Committee, the DNC, and these emails became the basis for stories centered on a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C., and became known as Pizzagate. That story alleged that Hillary Clinton and John Podesta, among other Democratic leaders, were the ringleaders of a pedophile trafficking ring operating out of a pizza parlor's underground tunnel network, and this also became incorporated later on in what is now known as QAnon. If we look at the search trends for Bridgegate and Pizzagate over the period in question, 2013 to the presidential election, we'll see that Pizzagate did not actually exist until the week leading up to the election in 2016, whereas Bridgegate was coming out in drips and drabs over time. And I think that's an important distinction between conspiracy and conspiracy theory, as we'll see later on. Conspiracy theory tends to almost jump fully formed in a very in a short time period, whereas conspiracies unfold over a much longer time period as investigative journalism does its job. Today's talk, we're going to start off with some basic folklore theory. I'm going to go very quickly through that because you're all folklorists and you all know this. We'll talk about legends, rumors, and the problem of fake news, a model of legend structure. All of this is going to be gone over very, very quickly because I know you want to get to the conspiracy theories and conspiracies, as well as what we've discovered in the COVID-19 forums that we have been focused on. So I'll talk a little bit about legends, rumors, and the problem of fake news. I'll talk about a generative model of legend structure, which is important if we're going to formalize the methods. And we need to formalize our approach if we're going to be able to apply computational methods. Then I'll talk about developing the model in collaboration with applied mathematicians, engineers, and computer scientists, where we focus on an actant relationship model, probably known best to most of us from the work by Grema. And we then generate narrative frameworks as summary network graphs, and I'll show you how we go about doing that. We'll come back to Pizzagate and Bridgegate. We'll talk about a model of conspiracy and conspiracy theory and how we can distinguish those. And then we'll talk about the COVID-19 conspiracy theories, which have emerged in forums such as Reddit and 4chan over the course of the past half year. I do think it's important to remind ourselves why folklore is so important at all of this. If we think about folklore as emerging from this productive tension between individuals and tradition, and it's circulating on and across social networks, we can see that computational methods, particularly when we can capture a lot of text, are perfectly suited to the study of this type of narrative expression. Another thing that I stress and that you're all familiar with is that stories aren't created from whole cloth. They often rely on existing stories, story structures, and conceptual frameworks that are negotiated between group members as they negotiate on an ongoing basis their cultural ideology. These features allow people to easily generate stories which are acceptable to their group, for stories to gain a foothold in the narrative exchanges of people in those groups, and for individuals to try and convince others to see the world as they do by telling and retelling, modifying those stories. Now, we're all familiar in this group with the connection between legends, rumors, and the problem of fake news. Legends and rumors obviously thrive in low trust or low information environments. And in this context, I rely on a standard characterization of the legend as short, believable, mono-episodic narratives told as true in informal settings, often conversationally. And we'll see that those social media forums like Reddit or 4chan actually are mimicking real world types of interactions where people are engaged in this give and take. Circulates on and across social networks. Rumor in this context can be seen as a hyperactive transmission state of legend. It's when a legend goes viral, but the rumor is often missing key structural features of the legend. For example, if there's a threat or disruption, rumor doesn't really provide the different strategies for dealing with that, nor does it provide a resolution. And the result of this is it pushes action into the real world. And we're seeing that almost on a daily basis in the United States now, with the demonstrations and the counter demonstrators, the people pushing for reform, and then the regressive and repressive groups counteracting them. Rumor basically says, here's a threat, what are you going to do about it? This all means that legend and rumor are closely related to what is now discussed as fake news, which David Lazar and his group have said is fabricated information that mimics news in content and form, but not in organizational process or intent. And that's very important because it takes advantage of certain folkloric features. It leverages fears and strategies for confronting those fears that are already in circulation in the communities it targets. And so this is at the basis of a lot of belief narrative, legends and rumors, but also at the basis of the construction of conspiracy theories. Now, conspiracy theories get an awful lot of impetus from the fact that there are real conspiracies out there. So that's why we focused on Bridgegate and Pizzagate, because of the interconnection and the seeming interdependence of the two. They both occurred in the same time frame, and they were actually related in some direct manner. So Pizzagate provides us with an interesting opportunity to explore the folkloric dimensions of fake news. We can interrogate the structures of legend and rumor. We can see how those stories can be aligned into story complexes, which provide a comprehensive worldview, an explanation for everything. This kind of monologic thinking is a key feature of conspiracy theories. And many of you in the Belief Narrative Network have pointed that out in your excellent work and research on rumors, legends, and conspiracy theories over the years. So we wanted to test some of these ideas at internet scale, and that's why we focused on these online forums where there are thousands or tens of thousands of people posting hundreds of thousands or millions of posts. Fortunately for us, the New York Times presented a form of ground truth. It's very hard to compare what you're doing computationally on something like Folklore unless you have some external data source to compare against. And so for us, we were able to take advantage of the fact that the New York Times had spent a great deal of time outlining the contours of Pizzagate and then presenting it as the same type of graph that we are trying to generate, which is a character interaction graph with the relationships between these characters labeled on the edges. So in this representation of a narrative, actants, people, places, and things, are presented as nodes or dots in the graph, and the lines between the dots, or the edges between the nodes, are the relationships between those nodes. Computationally, it's a machine learning problem where we have to jointly estimate all of the hidden parameters of the model. The people, places, and things, which we call actants, following Greimas, the contexts in which those actants interact and have a relationship, the set of relationships, which can actually be computationally represented as a hyperedge, which we decompose into single edges, and the edges and their labels, which is a concatenation of a range of action into classes, right? So people might refer to the same type of relationship using a wide vocabulary, and we want to concatenate that so we don't have a proliferation of edges and wind up with the kinds of hairballs that we see in a lot of network analysis. In later work, and this is the work we're doing on COVID-19, is we're trying to estimate what people see as potential threats, because threats usually precede strategies. So that will also give us a chance to see what people do in the context of a threat. And then also that might help us figure out the sequence of actions that are implicit in these larger narrative frameworks that allow you to tell a story based on the actants and their relationships. So we started off by devising a 3-level model of the legend, which adds a mesoscale, an intermediary scale between the deep level, the macro scale, and the surface level phenomena that we observe, that is the stories that we hear, the stories that we collect, which I would call the micro scale. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. It's based on the work of Labov and Valetsky and was modified by Nicolaisen in 1987, where the idea is that there are 6 main structural components. Many of you already know this, so I'm going very quickly through this so that we can get to the conspiracy theories. But one of the things that I found important was to theorize this complicating action. Not only what happened, but the 2 parts of what happens in these stories. There's some sort of threat or disruption, and then there's a strategy for dealing with that. And I believe that's deeply ideological. The approaches that you take for dealing with a threat or disruption are reflective of your worldview. And then whether or not it's a good strategy becomes part of the evaluation and result. And that gives us an ideological ranking of the different types of strategies for different types of threats. And so this is where we theorize the complicating action, recognizing that the range of threats or disruptions are limited and culturally determined. And so that's very important when we're trying to understand the context, the communities, the groups in which conspiracy theories start to emerge. And so on a formalization of this, we recognize that all models are essentially wrong, but some are useful. The earlier 2-level models were not terribly useful because of the jump over the context or the domains in which stories are actually told. So in this article toward a generative model of legend, this is the outcome of a lot of the work that we've been doing computationally and forcing me to rethink some theoretical ideas about how these stories function in societies and how people are able to generate stories and how those stories are modified while they circulate on and across these social networks. One of the important things that we recognized was that, and this comes both from Dundes, but also all the way back to George Boole, is that there are limits on what's permissible within a particular domain of expression. And so we formalized these domain level constraints on what was admissible. And that actually is derived not from a top-down approach, but from a bottom-up, we look at all of the stories people are telling, and the people themselves implicitly put boundaries on what's admissible within their community, within a particular domain. And so very quickly, this is the three-level model that we have, with legend structure basically being rooted in and anchored in the tradition context. So what types of genres are permissible in a group? The domain, this gives us the actants or relationships in the sequence that is permissible or admissible within that that area of discussion. So if we're talking about farming, we'll have farmers and animals and farm equipment. If we're talking about witches, we'll have witches and Satan and supernatural occurrences. So each of these domains have a series of limits. And legend, for example, in this model often relies on the intrusion of one domain, usually a supernatural and threatening domain, into a more mundane and common domain, something like farming. And so then the strategies are how to get that threatening domain out of its intersection with a non-threatening domain. What we discovered is that conspiracy theories aren't like that. Instead of just being one outside domain clashing with an inside domain, it tries to align multiple domains. And I'll show you how it does that a little bit later in this talk. And then, of course, stories, that's what we're all familiar with. These are the things that we collect or harvest from the internet. These are the contexts in which the story appears. That's is sort of where it's anchored, and the stories are instantiations of this underlying narrative framework, either in whole or in part. And it's here where we'll get evaluation, we'll get coda, we'll get abstract and things like that. So this model also breaks out those different structural features first proposed by Laboff and Valetsky. When we then do this, we try to provide a summary of the narrative framework, which is in fact what the New York Times did with their graph. So you could choose some of these nodes and some of these relationships, and you could present a post in one of these forums that would be acceptable in the context of the forum. So we're trying to, from the posts themselves, estimate what the different nodes are, but also the relationships and the weights on those relationships. Some of the work by Valter Andersson, for example, shows why this then becomes fairly robust and impervious to addition. So if you want to add something to this network graph, you either have to be there very early, or you have to get a lot of people to consider what you're posting as being valid within this domain. So it also puts limits on the domain itself. And so those limits can be changed, but it's a fairly long uphill battle. We developed this model based on looking at Danish witchcraft as something that I know very, very well, but I'm going to skip over that because I don't have that much time, and I know that we want to get back to the conspiracy theories. But here, what we did was we looked at what the main actants were from thousands of Danish stories about witchcrafts, the main threats, and the main strategies. And by doing so, it allowed us to also generate a story which could fit into this 19th century legend tradition. So that's the generative nature of the model. Once you have the narrative framework as a graph, you can do a sampling of that subgraph, and with some semantics and syntax that you put around it, you could generate a story that would fit well in that domain for that tradition group. So this brings us back to Bridgegate and Pizzagate. We use Bridgegate to model an actual political cover-up, and Pizzagate as a model of a fictitious political cover-up. And the question is, A, can we derive the underlying narrative frameworks for both of these events based on mining, based on applying computational methods to, in the case of Pizzagate, thousands and thousands of social media posts, and in the case of Bridgegate, hundreds of disparate newspaper accounts of what might be going on in the scandal. Then we want to represent those as graphs, and we can then compare our graphs to the graphs of the New York Times and validate our methods. And then we can dig deeper and see if we find structural features of either of these narrative frameworks that might help distinguish conspiracy theories from conspiracies. So Pizzagate and Bridgegate are both embedded in the well-known domain of American politics, and they rely on a very common narrative in America, at least, of the political cover-up. And this goes back certainly to Watergate. That's where we get Pizzagate and Bridgegate. That gate idea comes from the Watergate. But certainly there were conspiracies and conspiracy theories going much further back in our country's history. So one of our questions was actually, is the real world messier than fiction? And one of the things you might be familiar with if you are during COVID stay-at-home orders doing what I'm doing, which is binge watching a lot of detective series on television, is one of the features of those is what we call the wall of crazy. We're trying to figure out the relationships between different actors. And you're familiar with this. It's usually a big bulletin board, sort of like the one behind me here, with pictures and cutouts and various things and pieces of red string connecting them. And so this is a wall of crazy for all of the entities in Pizzagate from Reddit. And you look at that and you think, wow, that's pretty crazy. But the wall of crazy for Bridgegate looks like that. And so it's quite possible that one of the distinguishing features is that the real world is just much messier than the narrative world. The narrative world, after all, is efficient at conveying cultural ideology, and therefore it relies on perhaps a smaller subset of actants and relationships because you want to be able to keep them straight. There's no way that you can keep straight all of the relationships between all of the actants in New Jersey politics, nor would you want to do that. So challenge one is matching the New York Times graph. Could we do that computationally? That is to say, without a lot of manual intervention, could we match the New York Times graph for Pizzagate and also for Bridgegate, because New York Times did the exact same thing for Bridgegate? And if we did, are there things that we found that they didn't found? So this is basically a trade-off, precision and recall. Could we get the precision of the New York Times graph? Could we also find things that they didn't find? So we develop a pipeline of interlocking computational methods. I'm not going to go through these because they are actually detailed in our paper in PLOS One on Pizzagate and Bridgegate. And I encourage you to go there if you're interested in how we deployed all of these different computational methods to come up with these visual graphic representations of the complexity of these different narrative frameworks. So here's some examples of the posts and discussion that we worked with. And by cycling through all of those, doing this type of natural language processing, we were able to extract actants and concatenate them into coherent nodes. And we were also able to extract relationships between those nodes and concatenate them or collapse them into coherent categories of relationships between those nodes. And you do that over and over again for millions of posts, and you eventually wind up with a graph. We have a fairly sophisticated approach to this because we recognize that actants have different roles and different contexts. And so we do this context-dependent named entity recognition and then concatenation into things that we call supernodes. So for example, if we look at the supernode level, this is a very macro level, high scale level, satellite view of some relationships. We see some of these, the supernode and how it's linked to these other nodes. And then we can also drill down into more micro level, micro contexts and the independent relationships there within that. It does allow us to match the New York Times graph, but it also allows us to find certain things that weren't in the New York Times graph, but are very important to the discussion. In this case, the importance of Bill Clinton and the Clinton Foundation and their role in supporting this human trafficking ring. The New York Times includes in their graph cannibalism, which is actually not mentioned very much in the Pizzagate material. It's not until we get to the later conspiracy theory of QAnon where the cannibalism takes on a particular focus on Democrats eating the adrenal glands of young children for not entirely clear reasons, probably similar to narratives of eating children's hearts for either immortality or for great strength that we find in stories of robbers and thieves throughout Europe, certainly all the way up through the early 20th century. Now, we can get much more than the New York Times graph can get. One of the things we do is once we have all of these different nodes and their relationships, we run clustering algorithms on it to figure out what are the key communities in that graph, and then what are supporting communities. So, and then also what other types of narratives might be bubbling up in this conversation. So narratives that are bubbling up and might be attaching to a larger conversation, we call nucleations. Narratives or kind of storytelling about the entire corpus, we call meta-narrative storytelling. And then there are a lot of support communities that give us the raw material for the important nodes in the overall graph. And so here we've labeled them, and you can see we've got a Pizzagate meta-narrative, which is people talking about the fact that they're creating this Pizzagate narrative. We have the Edgar Welch meta-narrative, which is about a young man who actually went to investigate Pizzagate by jumping in his truck and going to the restaurant in Washington, D.C., and actually discharging his rifle in the restaurant as he was trying to find the underground tunnels and dungeons, of which there weren't any because there's no cellar to the actual pizza parlor. What's interesting there is that this confirms some of our fears that with rumor and also with conspiracy theory, when it reaches that viral level, it doesn't include strategies for dealing with the threat. And so it pushes those strategies into the real world. So Edgar Welch's strategy was to arm himself, drive to Washington, D.C., and, quote, investigate for himself. We also find what might be considered irrelevant or spurious discussions, but the spurious discussions here, which we've outlined in green, are actually related to pedophilia and other emerging narratives about human trafficking, including that the Red Cross is involved in some elaborate human trafficking enterprise, as well as sort of the 911 truthers and some of the other emerging conspiracy theories that actually, when we look later on at QAnon, QAnon has managed to bring those into the fold. Pizzagate completely falls apart after Edgar Welch does his, quote, investigation, and then it gets picked up and becomes a central part of QAnon later on. We get a lot of other stuff than just the New York Times graph, and I think that community graph shows that fairly well. One of the things that we can do that you can't do with a static illustration is you can drill down and, for example, look at what we call subgraphs, small parts of the graph at greater and greater detail. And so we find the subgraph of Tony Podesta owning Weird Art, which uses a secret code language and is promoting an pedophilia. Or, for example, John Podesta, turns out, at this very fine-grained level, is also following Satanism, according to posters in these forums. If you want to learn more about the Podestas, you would, for example, focus on the nearest neighbors of the Podesta supernode and we're able to get that level of detail as well. Bridgegate is an actual conspiracy. And so one of the questions is, what does an actual conspiracy look like when we model it with our methods? Instead of modeling it on social media, we looked at actual news media that was engaged in uncovering the complexity of this conspiracy. Fortunately, the New York Times had done exactly the same thing that they had done for Pizzagate, and that is build a network representation of actants and their relationships. And so again, we could simply say, well, can we match that with our automatic methods? And on the left is the New York Times graph, and on the right is our automatically generated graph. And so we derive that automatically from the news corpus. News corpora are far less messy and far less noisy than social media corpora. And so that might help explain why we got such a nice extraction with very little manual intervention. What's interesting is that this conspiracy is so complicated that if you really want to understand it, you have to go much deeper than this high-level representation, and you have to go down into the subnodes. And by looking at these subgraphs as ego networks, 1-degree networks from individuals, we could find all of these different relationships, and we could build a coherent story as to what happened in Bridgegate. What's interesting is that the actants in this are all from a single domain. They're all from New Jersey politics. They're all well-known people, and the relationships are all contained within New Jersey politics. What that means is that we can take out a person from the network, and the network will not be changed really at all. It'll just be missing a node and some edges. So it's very robust, as they say, to deletion, right? So one of the things we do in network theory is to try and see, how can I break a network into separate parts, right? And if it's easy to do that, right, then that means that the network has certain structural features, and that there's certain edges or certain players, actants, who are very important to keeping that together. What's also interesting about Bridgegate is it takes many years. It takes 7 years for all of this to come out, right? And so coming out in drips and drabs, nodes are being added, edges are being added, there's some deletions, there's some additions, but it takes a very long time for it to come out. Pizzagate was fully formed within 4 weeks of the first post about Pizzagate that we were able to find, right? So it might be a fundamental difference between conspiracies and conspiracy theories. So conspiracies take an awful long time to uncover, because partly the conspiracists don't want their story to be uncovered. Conspiracy theory, on the other hand, springs fully formed as a narrative, right? And so all of the actants and relationships are negotiated very quickly by the people contributing to that domain. So what's very interesting then is to look at the differences between Pizzagate and Bridgegate. Fictitious stories have almost no delay between the first appearance of their core actants and relationships, because a conspiracy theory is intended to be, it only exists in narrative, so it's intended to be fully uncovered. Whereas conspiracy is actually malign actors trying to cover up what they're doing, and it's only through the intervention of the legal system and investigative reporters that it actually comes out. What's interesting also is that fictitious stories are not robust. They're a small set of nodes or relationships that can result in splitting of the network. And we found this in Pizzagate to be the WikiLeaks. So it allows us to hypothesize that Pizzagate is actually made up of multiple domains. Remember, Bridgegate is a single domain. Pizzagate is made up of multiple domains, and there's a single cross-cutting domain, in this case, WikiLeaks, that provides the glue to put all of those domains together. And if you delete the WikiLeaks edges or nodes, the entire conspiracy theory falls apart. In Pizzagate, we find at least politics or democratic politics, casual dining, comic ping pong, for example, children, and then the added domain of Satanism, all of it held together by WikiLeaks. So if we look at how it's put together, this is not actually something to tell stories about. Barack Obama is supported by Democratic operatives, as is Hillary Clinton. John Podesta supports and works for Hillary Clinton. And John Podesta has a brother named Tony Podesta. So that's the fundamental high-level domain of politics in Pizzagate. Then we have food or casual dining. Families eat pizza, families have children, families visit Comet Ping Pong. Comet Ping Pong, like all businesses, has signs. Other businesses have signs. And James Alefantis owns Comet Ping Pong. And then their children and Satanists, right? And so this is kind of the first connection, and that's made through WikiLeaks. And if we put in WikiLeaks, we get all of the different domains connected. So if you look at the part on the right would simply be a legend, right? Families are worried about Satanists stealing their children from casual dining establishments. And then if we add in WikiLeaks, actually it turns out that the Democratic operatives are behind all of this, right? And so that's a three-level version of this. We realized that the Podesta brothers actually formed another type of domain. But if we look at the furthest right model here, this is the aggregate model, you'll see that each of these domains are not connected to each other. So if we project these four on the left, democratic politics, Podesta brothers, casual dining, and Satanism, into an aggregate graph, we see that all of the components are disconnected. But if we add in WikiLeaks, you see again in the furthest area, WikiLeaks provides the alignment between these four other domains to make the entire graph an aggregate graph. So how does that apply to COVID-19 conspiracies and conspiracy theories? The pandemic is a perfect information void for the creation of conspiracy theories, right? So there's a lot of people who are anxious about the virus, and we don't know a lot about the virus. And over the years, the trust in our information sources has been eroded. So it's a perfect opportunity for people to start to align different domains and turn them into conspiracy theories. Unlike Pizzagate, however, there's no single glue holding the possible conspiracy theories together, and this leads to a multiplicity of conspiracy theories. The one glue that is trying to muscle in on this is QAnon, with the drops from the Q clearance patriot, as he's called, and then all of the bakers who are interpreting those drops of breadcrumbs to try and align these domains in a single totalizing narrative framework. So over the past 6 months, we've been refining our methods, and we've also added a threat classifier so we can see which types of nodes are being represented as threats in the narrative frameworks that we are now extracting from 4chan, 8chan, and Reddit. We find 5 phenomena in this COVID conspiracy theory space. We see the emergence of new conspiracy theories, suggesting that, for example, 5G cellular is the root cause of the virus, aligning the domains of telecommunications, public health, and global trade. We see the alignment of newish conspiracy theories to form larger ones. So, for example, suggesting that Bill Gates is using the virus as a cover for his desire to create a worldwide surveillance state through the enforcement of a global vaccination program, thereby aligning it with anti-vaccination conspiracy theories and other conspiracy theories related to global cabals. And of course, there's a newer one that's now linking the Bill Gates conspiracy theories with the 5G conspiracy theories. So you see these different domains start to align, and what you're trying to do as a conspiracy theorist is to have one conspiracy theory to rule them all. And of course, that's the totalizing and monologic logic behind QAnon that is trying to align all of these different layers into a single conspiracy theory. Of course, there are competing ones that see it as a threat and others that see it as a hoax, which are fundamentally hard to align because they contradict each other. We're seeing nucleations of potential conspiracy theories, the hashtag film your hospital, which we suspect will be subsumed by some of these larger theories. The film your hospital is related to the hoax ones. QAnon, like I said, is trying to be a totalizing one. And then we also see interactions between conspiracy theories and the news. So factual events like setting up tents in Central Park for a field hospital to treat overflow patients are linked to conspiracy theories about child trafficking and underground tunnels where children are trafficked for this international trade. When we ran this on conspiracy theories up through June, we found 30 large communities of greater than 14 nodes for these different emerging narrative frameworks, and a total of 229 narrative frameworks or frameworklets, little ones. There were 4 main conspiracy theories. There were multiple nucleations, remember that's emerging narrative frameworks, and several meta-narrative communities that are kind of talking about what's going on. So the main ones we found were Bill Gates, 5G, and vaccinations. So I mentioned before that Bill Gates seemed to be part of a global cabal. And by the time we're measuring this, the Bill Gates 5G vaccination narrative frameworks have merged into a single one. All of the things that are being treated as threats are outlined in red here. So 5G is seen as a threat. Bill Gates is seen as a threat. Vaccinations are seen as a threat. And the virus, of course, is also seen as a threat. Another one that we discover is the emerging discussion of the bat either being related to wet markets or laboratories, research labs, and the role of the Chinese Communist Party in trying to hide what was going on. We also find lots and lots of discussion of this as a bioweapon, where the Chinese government is threatening the world population by the release, either deliberate or accidental, of this virus as a bioweapon. And then, of course, a competing conspiracy theory that the whole thing is a hoax, and that that it really is not much worse than the flu. And we also see this then being connected to other anti-scientific narratives that suggest that, for example, global warming is a hoax. And then we find a lot of supporting communities, the most important one being ones related to SARS, the flu, African-American communities, and then the question of testing. So we're still working on this, and the space is changing rapidly. And so any suggestions or data resources that you have would be eager to collaborate with you on those. We also find certain nucleations related to things like coronavirus tests and their what I call it, their efficacy in helping to track the virus. So in conclusion, I think our methods help us identify important actants and their interactant relationships from very noisy data. It allows us to construct a narrative framework graph that presents this multi-scale representation of the narrative space. We can identify context-specific threats and potentially strategies that people are proposing to deal with those threats. And then we can also identify network features that might help us classify conspiracy theories as different from conspiracies. They might be hallmarks of conspiracy theories. So what? Well, recognizing when something has the hallmarks of conspiracy can help us devise strategy for pointing out the nodes and relationships which are based on fiction. Remember, conspiracy theories are very fragile in a network sense. You can break them apart. We can also understand what people in different communities see as threatening and what they see as reasonable responses to those threats. And perhaps we can understand alternatives to responses that might be more productive of community and less destructive, like we're seeing in some of the counter demonstrations to the Black Lives Matter protests, particularly, for example, in Portland over the weekend. We also might be able to understand the motivations and potential target audiences for those conspiracy theories. And ideally, maybe we as folklorists can help contribute to taking action to minimize the damage of actions that might be taken on the basis of conspiracy theory. So we're well poised for dealing with this. We're right on the front line. And I think methods like the ones I've proposed here and the ones that I know that all of you are working on and have contributed in your theoretical work and your field work and the great work of all of the people in this belief narrative network towards understanding both the importance and the features of this type of storytelling. I want to thank you for being such a patient audience. I have to thank NSF and the Institute for Pure Applied Math, the Culture Analytics Long Program, my colleagues Vwani Roy Chowdhury, Shadi Shatsavari, Pavan Holler, Chani Wang, and also the Pizzagate, Bridgegate team of Peter Broadwell, Benham Shabazi, Ehsan Ibrahimzadeh, and then also my good friends and colleagues here in the Belief Narrative Network. Lots and lots of conversations with John Loudon about this and found them to be very productive. And also with many other members of the Belief Narrative Network. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing your questions.